Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about. So, what we're going to talk about today is the Constitutional Convention in detail. Now, in theory, you guys have already taken a civics and economics style course, if not actually civics and economics, and you should have already been exposed to the Constitutional Convention and how the current government is set up, how it functions, and all that. That's in a perfect world. However, I also realize that that class could have been, almost a year ago for you. And so what we're going to do today is, while talking about the creation of the Constitution could easily be 2 or 3 lessons, I'm going to go through and explain it to you in the format that I need you to understand it in. Hopefully a lot of this is review, if not 100% review. I think there's some cool stories that you may not have heard before, but as far as what's actually going to happen here and how our government is going to be designed at the Constitutional Convention, hopefully this is all going to be ringing bells for you and it's not brand new, because it's really hard for me to go through and explain House of Representatives and the Senate one by one and the value of each and how those work out from scratch in a really short amount of time. So I'm going to spend one lesson and explain to you how the Constitution gets created, how our government gets created, and kind of the story behind it. All right. So hopefully this is ringing bells. If for some reason you're still really lost, contact me and I'll work with you on it. All right. So let me make myself smaller here. So yesterday we had talked about Shays' Rebellion, how the Articles of Confederation were straight garbage, and they had to get rid of them. It was just completely useless. Mainly, if you remember, the inability to tax effectively, because there was no really functioning federal government, while simultaneously, without a federal government, there's no way to have a national military. We saw how catastrophic those events can be with Shays' Rebellion. The farmers got really mad because they were being taxed unfairly, and they started a rebellion. But with no federal army, they were the militia, and they could just wreck shop until other groups came together, other states, and shut down Daniel Shay. That happened in the winter of 1786 and 1787, lasted a couple months. So everybody agrees to show up in 1787 and discuss how to fix these things. The only state that doesn't show up, and we talked about this yesterday, was Rhode Island. Rhode Island, super angry, just like North Carolina is, because if you remember, North Carolina and Rhode Island had already paid back their debt to France and did not want to have to nationalize the debt. Means everybody in the country pays it the same if you create a federal government. And because of that, they wanted to boycott it. Rhode Island does boycott. North Carolina, however, reluctantly agrees when North Carolina is promised, in part by Alexander Hamilton, who's going to be one of the crafters here, that if North Carolina shows up out of a sign of respect for North Carolina and North Carolina sacrifice, the capital will be moved further south than where it's alternating between New York City and Philadelphia at the time. So they are going to meet here in Philadelphia. This picture right here is the famous picture of the Constitutional Convention. Now, this right here is George Washington. George Washington, as we've been talking about, is the superstar of the time. So when everybody shows up, they need a bouncer, a guy who's going to keep order and make sure things, methodically work through. So they choose George Washington as the president of the Constitutional Convention. His job is to sit up here and make sure everything goes smoothly. George Washington isn't going to vote on things. This is really important, and while it may not change history really that much if he wasn't, he was hands down. Everybody's like, George Washington needs to be the guy in charge. Everybody picked George Washington to be here, but what's important to understand is all of these dudes here, I'm not going to say they hated each other, because that's an unfair and too simplified of a concept, but these are the smartest guys in the country. And they're all very opinionated, and they all have their own specific ideas of what would make America great, all right? And they're not going to get along. They're all geniuses, but they're all going to get mad with each other. George Washington is important in keeping everything going smoothly the whole time they are here. these guys, and I love this picture because it's the biggest fake picture ever. This picture is painted well afterwards, and all these guys here are meticulously painted in because they're all, you know, super fancy and really important here. So there's a lot of historical inaccuracies about this picture that, you know, for common sense is historically inaccurate. Number one, they came in and they shut all the windows. The big reason for shutting the windows is they didn't want people on the outside listen to them talk about overthrowing the government and getting the idea that that's like a bad thing, because it's pretty obvious that it needs to be done. All right. So not only were the windows would be clearly closed, but this is in the middle of the summer. They're all wearing like 3-piece suits and stuff. They ain't gonna be wearing that. They're all in here. They ain't gonna be like in their boxers, but they're gonna be like one step above that. Super sweaty and all that. It's gonna be yucky. It's gonna be smelly. There's no air conditioning. All right. So they're locked in this room. All of these men that are all super worked up the whole time because you're shaping the country, and they're all gonna be super stinky. On top of all that, all right, and this is this is pretty cool. So there is no way they got along. I guarantee you a lot of this is going to end in just straight up fist fights, like just brawling here up one side and down the other. There's no way in this picture they're like, oh, I declare, sir, if I could have some time on the floor to discuss what I... That stuff ain't happening. They're like, oh, you come here, Billy, I'll punch you in the face. Like, that's probably more likely of what's happening here. Once the Constitution gets made, spoiler alert, and it's really popular, they're going to paint this picture. And this is a very famous picture, and all these guys are given credit for having created it, which is fantastic. But it is nowhere nearly as pleasant as what it appears here. So it's a much more dirty, angry, and probably profanity-laced endeavor than what is presented here. But, you know, after it's all said and done, and it's a fantastic creation, nobody's going to rat out the other people and talk about, you know, how ridiculous they all acted. However, what we do know is once all this is over and we get done talking about it today, the only person that comes out of this thing smelling like a rose, figuratively, I'm sure he stank too, George Washington. They all were at each other's throats so much the whole time. They come out like grumbling at each other pretty heavily. Except they all love George Washington. One of the big reasons for that's going to be George Washington, as the president of the Constitutional Convention, meaning the bouncer, he doesn't really have to make his views known that become controversial. All right. He's there to keep order. So when this side starts arguing like, and this side starts arguing, and they start attacking, George Washington's like, hey, you, sit down, shut up. And everybody's terrified. Like, oh. And they'll sit down. He's like, all right, I'll act like he got some sense and continue debating. Like, that was his job. So he commanded respect in this room, but he wasn't the one putting out the ideas. He just managed to make sure they got along and does a fantastic job. Just like coming out of Valley Forge, he is very good in managing nearly impossible situations, and that is one of the reasons George Washington is rightfully considered just a fantastic leader in the history of America. Not a lot of people could have done that, not to mention there weren't very many people that were capable of doing it around the world, much less to be here at this time in this position. So George Washington very much deserves a lot of the credit with that. Also, one other thing I want to talk about George Washington. I think I may have said this before. Dude's 6'2". Now, by modern standards, that's tall. But in present day standards, that would be closer to probably 6'5" or 6'6". Because people were shorter back then. So he's probably about 6'2", about 200 pounds. He is gigantic. War heroes, especially in men's mind, you expect a war hero to be this big, powerful person. If you're not and you're just average or slightly below average size, it's shocking. Like Napoleon. Napoleon wasn't tiny, but he was a little slightly below average. So they make fun of him for being short because it's really weird. George Washington, when you hear about him, he's supposed to be bigger than life. When he shows up in a room, he fits the image. All right. So Constitutional Convention, we have these guys here, and we're going to start talking about what they come up with today. All right. And again, hopefully this stuff is ringing bells from previous courses. The number one argument that is going to take place at the Constitutional Convention is representation. Period. Its own representation. Here's why. America, is going to create a federal government. And the federal government is going to have some final say-so on stuff. This is terrifying. Terrifying to the people over here. Because while we know we need it to tax and create an army, federal governments are notoriously abusive of their power. Because the only thing they can associate it with are kings and stuff in England and France and these other countries at the time. And they're really terrified of that. So, and this is what's crazy, all right? There's a whole bunch of smart people that are going to create a brand new style of government, all right? You got Alexander Hamilton here, Thomas Jefferson. These guys we'll talk more about in future units. When they make this government, they're pulling it from nowhere, all right? They're just pulling it out of a hat, more or less. So much so, these guys who make this from scratch in this room, after this becomes the Constitution and the rest of the world sees that it's effective, all right, and there's a lot of give and take here, after this, every democracy that comes out after America copies America. We, in America, don't have anybody to copy. We make it from the teachings of John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, ancient Greece, Rome. We put all these things together to try to look at where people failed in the past with the democracy and try to make it as good as possible from learning from past people's mistakes. We do a fantastic job in America, so much so that other countries, they don't look at John Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Greece, Rome. They look at America, which is very much a compliment to America to be able to pull this off. So here's the type of government they're going to want. So Greece was a democracy, which means all the citizens showed up and voted on every law. That's a problem because if you get people all worked up over something dumb, then the population can do dumb stuff without thinking it through if they all vote for it. So how Socrates got killed. In Rome, all right, they had a republic where they had representatives, but the representatives only really cared about keeping their job, and they had the bread and circuses. They spread themselves too thin. It was very complicated in Rome, and it didn't work as just a core republic. So America is going to take bits and pieces of both of them. We're going to be a democratic republic. That is what America officially is present day. Even though we are a democracy, we're a democratic republic. Meaning everybody's going to vote for representatives. Those representatives go run the federal government. But those representatives constantly have to be reelected or somebody else gets put in. So the representatives are designed to represent the people. All right. They agree on this. This is the style of government that we're going to have. They agree on this relatively early on. Federal government, we have representatives that are picked by the people. If they start doing dumb stuff, the people get to pick new representatives. The representatives are the ones that make the laws, not the people. The people just pick the representatives. So it becomes pretty obvious that representation in the government is very important because there's 13 states and they're going to have have one central power where they don't want the other states to team up on them, or they don't want the federal government to team up on them. So each state immediately is trying to finagle how my state can get the most representatives in Congress. Because representation in Congress, the more people you can have in Congress, in the government, the more power you have. Representation equals power in the United States. So how are you going to divide up the power in the United States? How are you going to divide up representation by the states? All right, I'll show you the two ideas here. Well, Virginia here, and this is Virginia. All right, so when we talk about Virginia, it's what is present day Virginia, Kentucky, and West Virginia is a huge area. By far the most populated state. Virginia's I know how we do representation. Let's base it on population. If you have a bigger population, you have more representatives. That makes sense. And to Virginia, it does, all right? Because, hey, you should have more power in the government if you have more people that need representation. So all the big states are yeah, that's cool, all right? So they call that the Virginia plan, base representation on population. New Jersey, where's New Jersey? Right here. New Jersey while today it's like the most densely populated state in the United States, at the time it was very rural. And New Jersey's like, oh, we got like 6 people. If you base it on population, Virginia gets like 100 people in Congress, we get 2. No, because then Virginia can just bully the smaller states. If you base it on population, the states with a bigger population can just do whatever they want, and the smaller states have no say-so. New Jersey's like, so our plan is, we're all states, we're all equal. We're all equal. We each get 2 representatives from each state, because one state's not better than another state, and we all sit here and work it out. Virginia's like, absolutely not. We have 1 billion people, make-believe numbers. We have a massive amount of people. You have 6. That's not equal. Those 6 people and their unique views should not influence the entire state of Virginia. So they're like, squabble, 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 fight, 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 fight. And then George Washington stands up and says, sit down and shut up. Now talk it out. So the New Jersey plan is the idea that all states are equal. Virginia plan is the idea that the bigger the state, the more representatives you can have. Their compromise on this is called the Great Compromise. There's like 5 compromises in American One, in the early part of U.S. history here. And a lot of them, they're going to register because they have like the name of the compromise helps you remember it. This one's always hard to remember just because it's called the Great Compromise. There's nothing in the Great Compromise that's going to trigger something, so you kind of have to memorize that. So when we talk about the Great Compromise, we're talking about the creation of our current Congress with the Senate, all right, which means all states are equal. Present day, and when this is recorded, all states are equal and every state has 2 senators. Whereas there's also the House of Representatives. Based on your population size, you have more people in your represented in the House of Representatives. Modern example, California, I believe, has 54 representatives because they are by far the most massive state. North Carolina, I believe, last I checked, has 14 representatives. California has 54. Montana has the smallest, and they have 3. So Montana has 3 representatives, North Carolina has 14, and California has 54, but that's only in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, they all have 2 senators. With that being said, the most important part of this is the fact that the Senate and House of Representatives, so the Senate takes the New Jersey plan, and the Virginia plan is the House of Representatives. Present day, in order for a law to get passed, the Senate, where every state is equal, and the House of Representatives, which is based on population, have to agree on a law. All right, so 2 House legislature. So the Senate and House of Representatives absolutely have to get along. So the question here is, why was representation such a big deal to the American people during the creation of the Constitution? We had talked about that pretty well. So pause me and go through and answer that in 2 complete sentences if you need to. So the Great Compromise is what we just talked about. It takes the Senate and House of Representatives and from the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, and they merge them together to create what we call now Congress. All right, so you have senators and representatives. So there's 2 halves of Congress, and in order for them to agree, in order for a law to pass, they have to agree. So, and that just makes up this one part of our government is the legislative branch. So, like if you divided this in half, man, I can't draw a straight line, save my life. You'd have the House of Representatives is one half, and then the Senate is the other. All right, and that makes up the legislative branch that creates laws. So present day, that is still how it is. All right, if you notice, there's 3 branches of the government. This comes from Montesquieu's idea of 3 branches, and that way they can have checks and balances on each other. So 31, the Great Compromise created our present-day legislative Congress system. Explain how it used pieces from both the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. So pause that, go through, answer that in 2 complete sentences. We've talked about that in detail. All right. The Three-Fifths Compromise. So the Three-Fifths Compromise comes up more often in present day with race relations and things like that. So I want to clarify what the Three-Fifths Compromise is. So famously, people like to say, and it's a little distortion of it, but they're not wrong, that the Three-Fifths Compromise counts slaves as 3/5 of a person. They're not wrong, but it really sounds like they are specifically caring about the slaves enough to decide how much of a person they are. Slaves didn't get that much consideration, right? This was more, it's a completely political battle for other reasons than actual slavery itself, all right? So I don't know if that makes it any better or worse, but the actual slaves themselves aren't really considered as far as humans at all. Not even 3/5 of a humans, not all or not. They were never discussed. So we're going to talk about why the Three-Fifths Compromise gets passed. Here's what the argument is. Once they determine that at least part of your representation in Congress, and representation means power, at least part of your representation in Congress in the House of Representatives is based on your population, everybody starts to talk about how big the population is in their state. So now the South is very rural and the North is not, right? North is urban. So there's some guy going through, it's like, okay, since we come up with the House of Representatives, let's go through and see what your population is. New York, how many people do you have in your state? And New York's like, I have 1.2 million. And they're like, all right, awesome. And they're like, Massachusetts, how many do you have in your state? And Massachusetts is like, I have 1.4 million. And they're like, okay, let's write that down. And they're like, all right, Georgia, you know, there's like 3 people in Georgia, they assume. Like, all right, Georgia, how many people are in your state? And Georgia's like, I have 1.7 million people. And the guy's writing, he's like, and like all the Northerners turn and like look at Georgia, and they're like, what? It's like, you don't have 1.7 million people. Like the last time there was a vote, you had like 400,000 votes. You have one. Don't lie. He's like, I have 1.7 humans in Georgia. And everybody's like, wait, what? And then all of a sudden, somebody from the North is like, that's some bull crap. You're counting your slaves. And Georgia's like, absolutely I am. I'm counting my slaves because you asked me how many people are there. I'm counting my slaves. And they're like, if you don't count your slaves, how many do you have? And he's like, 400,000. Like some much smaller number. So the North is like, yeah, we're not counting your slaves. Absolutely. So the North doesn't want the South to count their slaves, because if they don't count their slaves, who has a bigger population and therefore more power? The North. Even at the Constitutional Convention, there's already this cultural split between, they're all slave states kind of at the time, very few are starting to outlaw it yet, but the South has committed to slavery because it's agriculture. The North doesn't really need slaves the way the South does, so there's already starting to be a split. So it's like the slave states and the non-slave states. And the North is like, you can't count your slaves. And the South's like, yes, I can. And they get really worked up over this. So not only that, the North is like, wait a minute. Aren't slaves property? And the South is like, yeah. And they're like, so property tax is a thing, and y'all ain't paying property tax on the slaves that y'all consider property. Now, that would be a lot of money the South would have to spend. So the slave owners are like, shut up, don't talk about that. Like, they don't want to talk about, you know, taxing slaves, because that'd be crazy expensive, because slaves are very, very expensive. So the taxes on slaves would be really high. So they argue and they argue and they argue. They probably get up, fist fight. George Washington has to tell them to sit down and shut up. And then they're going to come up with a Three-Fifths Compromise. This is for the time. Now, granted, you're talking about slavery, so nothing's ever like cool. But the decision for the Three-Fifths Compromise is pretty interesting. And logically, if you take out the human element of it, it makes sense. So the decision is, and it's called the Three-Fifths Compromise, the South will be allowed to count 3 out of every 5 of their slaves. So they're not actually going through and saying a slave is 3/5 of a person. They're like, how many slaves do you have in your state? You have 800,000? Okay, we're only going to count 3/5 of that number, and that's what your population is, so that you can appoint people into Congress. But again, it's all white people. It's not like slaves are going to be represented in Congress. So it's not necessarily counting an individual slave as 3/5, even though if that's your interpretation of it, you wouldn't be wrong. But they're not thinking about the individual people. They're thinking about the number as a whole. So here's why 3/5. So they're only going to allow the South to count 3/5 of their total number of slaves. All right? It's not just because they were old-timey people and loved math and make it difficult. Like, why not all of them? Why not none of them? Why not half? Just make it easy, half. Why 3/5? Here's why. If you count all the free people in the South and only 3/5 of the slaves, the population in the South and the population in the North completely equal. If the populations are equal, one side can't have more representation than the other. Therefore, making it fair. That is why they're only going to count. That's why the math number 3/5 comes out, is to, on paper, equal the populations between the North and the South. Since the South is already like massively committed to slavery and there's a lot of African slaves in the South, that is where the term the Threefifths Compromise comes up. So not only are they going to count 3 out of 5 slaves, which angers the North beyond measure because they don't want them to count at all, in order to kind of make the North happy, if they count them in population, you also have to pay taxes on 3 out of 5 slaves in the South. So it's a much larger tax revenue stream as well. So not only are you going to count 3 out of 5 slaves in the South, you're actually going to tax them as well. It does not free any slaves. I ask that on tests sometimes, like, hey, what did the Threefifths Compromise not do? It does not free slaves. The Threefifths Compromise doesn't free anybody. It has to do with slavery, but it doesn't free anybody. So don't put that. This is, if you want to pause this and look at this, is basically what we just got done talking about. And then the question is, why was there a Threefifths Compromise? And go through and explain that to me. All right. Other things created by the Constitution. All right. Federalism. It's a political system where power is shared between the national and state governments. Really important to understand here that the Constitution does not say who is more powerful, the federal government or the state governments. They have to work together. Now, today, we tend to think that if the federal government tells the state to do something, the state will have to do it. All right. That's the mentality, and the Constitution hasn't changed, but the reason we think that is because of what will be the Civil War, all right, which is over slavery, and states versus federal governments caused by slavery. Civil War, 100% caused by slavery. So federalism is the idea that they have to work together, which is, you still see it today, and as we get through U.S. history, we'll talk more issues of the states and the federal government squirreling. In theory, the federal government does not have the right to tell a state what it can or can't do, just like the state governments can't tell the federal government what to do. And that's the idea of federalism. They have to work together. Separation of powers is like the Montesquieu's. You have your 3 parts of your government. They have to work together, keep from being corrupt. Checks and balances is where different parts of the government keep an eye on parts of the government that they're not associated with to make sure they're not getting out of hand. All of this stuff is boring. It's boring. We all know it's boring. And you know what? If you're sitting here like, oh, this is so boring. Good. Good. When we talk about the United States government and it's boring, that's great. You know why? Boring governments are good governments. You know who has an exciting government? North Korea. What's that dude going to do every day? The more exciting your government is, the worse it is. All right? So boring stuff like checks and balances, you want your government to be boring. It means it's running efficiently. All right. The more in the background it is and the less exciting it is, typically the better it's working. So when you're learning about the government and how boring it is, that's a really good thing. Congress, New Jersey and Virginia plans, and the president. So the Electoral College comes out. So the Electoral College is important to mention. It's been coming up here recently in modern elections. It's been a really long time since it was an issue. So in the 2016 election and in the 2000 election, the person who got the most votes lost legally, because that's how the Constitution is set up. And I'll explain that to you. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump. Oh, I'm going to say some numbers here, and I'm probably going to make a fool of myself because it's a quick Google to see how wrong I am. I want to say it's like 54 million for Hillary Clinton and 51 million for Donald Trump. The numbers overall might be lower than that, but I know there's a 3 million person gap. 3 million more people in 2016 voted for Hillary Clinton for president, and Donald Trump won in a landslide. And that is 100% legal. That is how the Constitution is designed. All right. Now we can argue all day whether or not that's fair or not, but that is completely legal. That nobody broke any laws because that's how the election of the president works. And let me tell you why. So these numbers here, and this is the most recent one. I think they have changed since then, but these are the ones in my brain. These are how many representatives each state has based on their population. This is also the total number of votes the state gets during a presidential election. And the president's the only one that's elected like this. So in North Carolina, when there's a presidential election, everybody shows up at the polls to vote. Whichever way the majority of people vote in North Carolina. So say there's candidate A and candidate B. If 52% of people in North Carolina vote for candidate A, and 48% vote for candidate B. That means candidate A won North Carolina, and candidate A gets all 14 of these votes. Those are the only votes that count. All right? There's 535 votes, so the moment you hit 278 votes, because these are the only votes that get counted, not the popular vote, not the vote by the people. When you vote for the president, you're just telling your state which way to cast their vote. Whoever gets the majority in a state gets all the electoral votes. So presidents, when they run for president, aren't very worried about the popular vote. They're not. They got to win more states. Whoever wins the most states, oversimplifying, whoever wins the most states wins the presidency. So here's how Hillary Clinton can get 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but Donald Trump still won in a landslide by electoral standards. The states that voted for Hillary Clinton, we'll say California, all right? 98% of the people in California voted for Hillary Clinton, but she got all those votes. We will say in Texas, 52% of the people in Texas voted for Donald Trump, and 52% of the people in Florida voted for Donald Trump. All right? It means 48% in Texas voted for Hillary, and 48% in Florida voted for Hillary. However, since Donald Trump won Texas, he gets all 32 votes. In Florida, he gets all 25 votes. So what happened is in the states that Hillary Clinton won, she got almost all the votes in those states. In the states Donald Trump won, he barely won in those states. But at the end of the day, he won way more states than Hillary Clinton did, even though more people in America voted for Hillary Clinton. It's the Electoral College, all right? That's how it works. If you're like, why? Here's why. It's a check and balance on the American people. The American people, they didn't trust them at the Constitutional Convention. They thought they might be squirrely, they might be dumb, and because of that, they didn't want them. They didn't want the people to make the final say-so. So this is a check and balance on the American people. In theory, if everybody here in North Carolina voted for Satan, the Electoral College, these 14 guys that cast their votes, could cast their vote for somebody else. They don't have to follow what the state says. Now, if that actually happened in real life and the state cast their vote different than how their state voted, it would be absolutely pandemonium. It has never happened. And since then, it is illegal. The state, if North Carolina today votes for Satan, they'll cast their vote for Satan. Like they're required to. All right, even if it's a really bad idea, they're required now. So the Electoral College was put in as a check and balance on the American people because the American people kind of dumb. All right, or that was the opinion. So how does the Electoral College work? So explain that in detail, and that's as far as we're going to get to today.